Little 7-year-old Lucas Thompson went missing on a wonderful Caribbean cruise, taking with him just his beloved plush penguin off the deck. His parents had been inconsolable for 10 years due to their fruitless search, until a knock on their door one stormy night altered everything. Particularly when Lucas uttered something that had his parents dumbfounded, the events that transpired throughout those years would startle everyone. A deafening boom rocked the serene morning aboard the Symphony of the Seas, trembling each of its 17 decks. As the ship's emergency sirens went off and thick black smoke billowed from the engine room, the pool area resounded with cries and shouts. As terrified people pushed and shoved their way past them, Ava Thompson let go of her son's hand, who was 7 years old, during the mayhem. She yelled out, "Lucas!" as she navigated the throng in a panic. "Lucas!" The piercing sirens and frantic cries overwhelmed her voice. She had been seeing Lucas's antics at the pool's shallow end just a short while ago. Even though he stood out among the other kids thanks to his bright red jacket, she could only make out fleeting glimmers of the color as the throng rushed to the safety stations. A guy carrying a professional camera was seen escorting Lucas away in the final clip from the security cameras. With their hands interlocked, the two hurried past the terrified throng. Half an hour after the ship's crew brought everything back to normal, both Lucas and the stranger were nowhere to be seen. Mr. Waddles, Lucas's beloved plush penguin, sat delicately on a deck chair as if put there on purpose. That was all that remained. Lucas had asked Ava to help him put on his special cruise outfit, a red jacket, hours before the explosion, explaining that he had chosen it so penguins could see him from a distance. She'd applied sunscreen to his cheeks and nose with great care, covering up the little freckles he'd inherited from his dad. As he pledged to remain in close proximity to her lounge chair, Lucas had been giggling with delight while holding on to Mr. Waddles, his cherished plush penguin. "Please, Mom, let me play in the pool area. Mr. Waddles wants to watch me," Lucas had pleaded, his blue eyes shining. Ava recalled just where she had placed her chair, at an angle that allowed her to gaze at the pool and her kids simultaneously, all the while immersed in her summer romance book. He couldn't find him among the devastation caused by the explosion. Lucas had already disappeared 45 minutes after the ship's crew had given the go-ahead. A group of people, including 12-year-old Emily James, gathered around the distraught mother. With her black eyes wide with concern, she held onto her mother's sleeve, her emotions on the verge of bursting. "Mom," she murmured, "I need to tell someone about the man." While on vacation with her family, child psychologist Dr. Linda James picked up on her daughter's anxious tone. There was no ignoring this, she realized. "Which man, darling?" Linda said, leading Emily toward the expanding contingent of ship security personnel. Emily was visibly shaken. He had a camera, a big professional one with a long lens. He was showing Lucas pictures of penguins on his phone, right before the explosion happened. She took a breath. But the weird thing was, when Lucas got excited about the pictures, the man wasn't really looking at him. He kept glancing around, like he was checking if anyone was watching. And when the alarms went off, I saw him grab Lucas's hand and start running. As Officer Maria Rodriguez listened to Emily's story, her heart skipped a beat. A stranger who is friendly, for a brief intermission. In the blink of an eye, a kid vanishes. Quickly coordinating with the engineering staff, the ship's security team set out to examine the incident. The source of the explosion was subsequently identified as a homemade device that had been wedged behind a sunbed on the main deck, away from the onlookers. The criminal profilers who were involved in the investigation concluded that the device's placement was intended to divert attention rather than do harm, just long enough to seize a kid and flee. David Thompson, Lucas's dad, showed up at the ship's security office with an untucked shirt and untidy hair after dashing across the deck. "He always brings Mr. Waddles, his plush penguin, with him everywhere he goes," he said, running his fingers through his thinning hair. "He's wearing a red jacket." As he said his last phrase, his voice quivered. The ship's chief information technology officer, John Kumar, was already perusing the surveillance video when something piqued his interest. He indicated, "Wait," as he rolled back the tape for the third time. "Look at this." Lucas and Mr. Waddles were seen in the film chatting with a guy holding a professional camera as they walked near the deck railing. Following the explosion, hordes of terrified travelers rushed to the scene. Lucas had gone by the time the mayhem subsided. Mr. Waddles was the last one remaining, perched precariously on a deck chair. With a scowl on his face, Kumar pressed his fingers rapidly over his keyboard. He said, "The timing is too perfect," more to himself and not to anybody else in the room. The explosion took out our primary security systems for exactly 3.7 minutes. Someone hacked our backup systems too, created a blind spot at exactly the right moment. He drew up yet another window with text that scrolled. This isn't amateur work. They knew our protocols, our systems, everything. With her trained eye, Officer Rodriguez saw nuances that others may miss as she looked over Kumar's shoulder. With her fingers already extended toward her phone, she said, "Can you trace it?" as she prepared to summon her worldwide law enforcement network. There was a familiarity with the hack despite its sophistication, all too common. In the meantime, search boats and aircraft from the Coast Guard showed there, their strong headlights piercing through the increasing darkness. Ava held Mr. Waddles close to her bosom, inhaling the lingering aroma of her son's beloved strawberry shampoo, while the sound of rotors resounded throughout the air. As he stood at the railing, David stared down at the dwindling waves below, his knuckles white from holding the metal bar. However, Lucas could not be located. By the time he was transferred to a smaller vessel, it had already sailed away. Over the next few days, the ship's schedule underwent a radical transformation. People on the plane murmured to one another in lower voices. Families embraced one another. The security detail checked every deck, room, and potential hiding spot. In an effort to jog her memory of the enigmatic photographer, Emily James couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with Lucas, which kept her from getting any rest. "He wore a blue cap," she informed Officer Rodriguez during their third interview. The ever-expanding dossier that would track this case for years would have meticulous notes on every element. The Thompsons' Connecticut home served as the search's nerve center upon their return. After carefully transferring Lucas's prized penguin collection to the wall shelves, Ava turned his bedroom into an office. David devoted many hours on the internet, where he made international connections with other parents whose children had gone missing. His voice would become scratchy from making late-night calls, but he would insist that someone must know something. They partnered with every missing children's group that would listen, made TV appearances, and provided incentives. Unsettling trends were uncovered by the inquiries. Someone with extensive understanding of the ship's systems installed the complex device that triggered the explosion. Lots of other Caribbean cruise ships have experienced the same thing. Afterwards, a kid goes missing. The criminals were experts in their field, relatively calm, very careful with their preparation. Lucas had begun a new life in a little fishing hamlet in Colombia, unbeknownst to everyone who was looking for him. He yelled out for his parents, but no one could or would hear him since he didn't speak Spanish. Also missing was the cameraman. His newfound family consisted of the elderly couple who had rescued him, Miguel and Elena. They showed him the ropes of seafaring life and gave him the name Carlos. While they repaired nets, Miguel taught him to interpret the weather by looking at the patterns in the clouds, while Elena would sing traditional melodies. A hefty secret nonetheless was held by Miguel and Elena. They were aware of the cartel's activities, including the employment of local fishing boats to transfer abducted children. They had been clandestinely assisting youngsters in escaping the cartel and reuniting them with trustworthy relatives in other regions for years. They were able to identify Lucas based on his description in the news when they located him. However, speaking up would have resulted in their demise, as well as the boys. They shielded him instead, mentored him. They cherished him like a child. Over time, they succeeded in erasing most of his memories of his background by filling his mind with made-up tales about their history together. As he matured into a kind young man, Lucas established a modest school program in the community, where he taught English to elementary-aged kids. Nobody had seemed to wonder how a young Colombian could speak it so well, and he certainly didn't dare to question himself about the nightmares he had at night, in which he spoke English constantly to faces that were becoming more hazy. For the smaller kids, he would draw penguins in the sand and tell tales about a stuffed penguin called Mr. Waddles and his fantastical exploits. His passion for penguins was unending. At the same time, Officer Rodriguez persisted. She uncovered a string of such cases involving children and cruise ships in the Caribbean, all of which had unexplained explosions or technical issues as their cause of disappearance. She established a system of informants all across the area, including local fishermen who served as her spies in the sea. When Miguel became sick and required emergency surgery at Puerto Limon's Hospital Central, that's when things started to look up. After making up his mind, 17-year-old Lucas had to go to the city with his adoptive parents. Lucas spotted something that made his blood run cold as they waited in the packed hospital department. A guy whose face he had not seen for years, but would never forget, walked by him as he entered the building via the staff door. The cameraman from the cruise liner, was it? Lucas, now older and weathered, was strolling hand in hand with a little kid whose eyes had the same bewildered expression as Lucas's own upon his arrival in Colombia. He was completely unknown to the guy. Lucas, meanwhile, was taken aback and unable to respond. In New York, Officer Rodriguez was continuing to make progress on her case. A Costa Rican investigator tipped her off about suspicious activity in several Caribbean communities after she had spent years cultivating contacts with police forces around the area. What Lucas observed in the hospital was too much for him to ignore. Miguel couldn't get any rest in the chair next to his adoptive father's bed after that night's operation. Unsure and wary, Lucas informed Elena of his observations. She was caught off guard by her reaction, her stiff muscles, and her avoidance of his gaze. All of her secrets were revealed that night. Despite Miguel's and her recognition of him from news stories, they remained quiet when they discovered him on the shore due to fear. The words, "We thought we were protecting you," came out of Elena's thin, quivering voice. "The cartel runs everything here. Speaking out would have gotten us killed. And you too." Tears were wiped away by her. "But maybe now, with you grown, it's time to stop hiding." Lucas personally contributed the last piece. Hearing Elena's confession prompted him to phone the police tip line in an anonymous manner. As he recounted his knowledge, his voice quivered. Despite his inability to recall his given name, he did manage to disclose something that piqued the officer's interest. An explosion that occurred on a cruise ship a decade ago. A photographer. Images of penguins. The Costa Rican police agency called Officer Rodriguez the next day with an emergency. Her pulse rate increased as she listened to the tip's specifics. A little child was abducted aboard the Symphony of the Seas amid an explosion. The details were spot on. She didn't waste any time getting a plane ticket to Costa Rica. At Hospital Central, Rodriguez saw a towering adolescent patiently waiting for Elena. Even though it had been 10 years, she could still see the happy child from the missing person posters in his eyes. Lucas sat down with Elena in a peaceful office and told her his tale. He had been raised by Miguel and Elena as Carlos, but he had never fully understood his history and was plagued by fragments of recollections. "I believe I recognize you," Rodriguez said as he delicately withdrew a weathered case file. A picture of a little kid, maybe 7 years old, cuddling a plush penguin was what she presented to him. "Does this look familiar?" As his palms quivered, Lucas fixed his gaze on the photograph. It was the plush penguin in the photo that he recalled. Mr. Waddles. Out of nowhere, the name and a flurry of recollections flooded his mind. Perched on the edge of a swimming pool, sunscreen on his nose, applied by his mother. As crucial witnesses against the trafficking network, Miguel and Elena were safeguarded by Lucas before he left Colombia. They rescued him and brought him up as their own. At this point, he would not leave them. Rodriguez gave him the assurance that they would be put in a program that protects witnesses. On the way to Connecticut, I felt a mixture of anxious anticipation and hopeful anticipation. As they attempted to put pieces of his broken history back together, Officer Rodriguez sat down next to him and gently guided him. Lucas, however, was unconcerned with the specifics and instead focused on a single question. Would his parents forgive him if he forgot about them? Standing on a doorway he had never known but felt a connection to at 9:47 p.m. With the rain soaking his hair and streaming down his face, Lucas was deeply moved. As she gave Lucas the space he needed, Rodriguez sat in the vehicle, her heart burdened by the gravity of the situation. Pressing the doorbell, he took a deep breath, his pulse racing. Muted footsteps approached as the sound echoed through the home. He stood still while David Thompson pried open the door. A tall, drenched adolescent with straggly black hair grazing his forehead and brown eyes locked into his own stood before him. "Mom? Dad?" Lucas said, his voice quivering with fear. With a hint of Spanish accent, it had become deeper. "I'm sorry I forgot, but I remember now." As Ava hurried to the door from inside the home, her coffee cup dropped from her grasp and shattered on the kitchen floor. Upon catching sight of him, her breath froze. A decade his senior, yet undeniably Lucas. Her son stood there, soaked in rain and quivering. She drew him close and said, "My boy." Earlier, she clutched him firmly, terrified to let him go, as tears mixed with the rain streaming down her cheeks. "My precious little boy." Lucas, who was also crying, stared at her. "I'm sorry it took me so long. Do you forgive me?" Ava sobbed more onto her son's breast as she continued to cry. She did not respond. The reply came from David, and his voice was soft. "There's nothing to forgive, Lucas. We're together now. That's all that matters." Officer Rodriguez climbed out of the vehicle and into the porch light, clutching a file tight to her breast before anybody could begin to ask questions. Her own eyes betrayed her as she drew near. "I have everything here to help fill in the gaps. This is your son's story. It's time for him to come home," she said as she stood still for a minute, letting the family hug. The reconnection marked the start of a much more significant narrative. The more Lucas related his story, the more the parts fit together. Elena's and Miguel's expertise, together with his testimony, provided the police with the proof they needed to solve the trafficking case. In her fishing logs, Elena had secretly recorded information about missing children and the names of the vessels involved. In order to identify the coastal hideouts where the traffickers kept the youngsters before shipment, Miguel monitored their radio frequencies. A multinational task team quickly broke the trafficking network, apprehending important figures such as the cruise ship photographer and the bomb plotters. This happened within a matter of weeks. 15 other youngsters who had gone missing were located during the operation. In Costa Rica, Elena and Miguel joined other families who had shielded children from human trafficking by entering witness protection. The ring's leaders were convicted thanks to their evidence, while other members were given life sentences. Now that they were free from cartel control, Elena and Miguel's fishing community in Colombia formed networks with other coastal villages to ensure the safety of children. Their deeds demonstrated that anti-trafficking efforts might be successful if they were persistent and methodical. What we see in Lucas's narrative is that miracles are not the result of random coincidence, but rather the result of the bravery and persistence of regular people who refuse to give up. They could even alter the course of history while they're doing it. Is there anything you would do if a loved one suddenly disappeared? If you wanted answers, would you keep looking, praying, and struggling? Post a comment telling us. My sincere appreciation for your time. Till our next video, take care.